There we go. All right. Good morning and good afternoon, evening to everyone. We have folks from all over the world on here right now. Some people will be also watching on YouTube at a later date. So, this is our next and final Zoom session of this year's Behavior Month. And our topic or theme this week was welfare around the world. We still have some content left, so it's only Friday. So we do have a couple more days, but we're going to recap the week and some of the content that was provided with some of the contributors that are here. And we also have our special guest, Sabrina Brando, who, if you listen to the podcast, Animal Behavior Conversations, she was on ABMA's most recent podcast. It's actually a two-parter because it was a really good conversation, lots of good information, and you're going to share a little bit more of that at the first part of this Zoom. But for those of you who do not know me, I'm Justin. I'm one of the board of directors on ABMA's board, and the host of today's Zoom. So what we're going to do is have Sabrina first talk about not enrichment. That's not today. We're going to have Sabrina talk about welfare, and we could talk about welfare for hours and hours, but we're going to try to do about 10-ish minutes or so, and then talk about some of the content that was shared this week and will be shared. And then we do encourage questions, comments from everybody joining in. So I will try to do my best to keep an eye on the chat. Raise your hand, put something in the chat, or just kind of chime in as the conversation goes on. But without further ado, we're going to let Sabrina share her screen and talk a little bit more about welfare.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation. I will immediately start sharing my screen so we can start. If you can just let me know if you can see this okay.
Looks good on my end, Sabrina.
Okay, I'm just going to put it in presenter mode. Excellent. Okay, yes, so around the world, and today I'm going to talk a little bit more about animal care and well-being, and specifically from a perspective that, if you know the work that we've been doing for many years now, is all about 24/7 across lifespan. And the important part, of course, is when we're thinking about animal care and well-being, or the zoo or aquarium or whatever organization or shelter or wherever you work, is to always have this sort of bird eye view about what are all the things, because welfare is always, right? There's no moment where there's no welfare. This well-being is on a continuum from good to poor, depending on all kinds of internal and external things. So it's good for us to, whether we're thinking about animal training or enrichment or anything else that we do, that we take this sort of bird's eye view from an organizational perspective, and then of course also zoom in to the individual, because ultimately the well-being is about individual animals, about their personality, about all the things that we know as animal care staff, as trainers, that is going to be important to keep in mind when we are interacting with the animals, training them, and anything else that we do with them. Of course, when we think about animal well-being, it's all about animals, but it's also about the organization. It's about teams and leadership and all those different aspects of a zoo, and I'm going to come back to that later. And of course, it's also about you, and I am very delighted to see that between the training and enrichment and other content, there's also focus on you, or teams and leaders. Everybody, of course, is a human being. So how do we stay well in doing our jobs, caring for animals and conservation, which is part of my PhD. So I'm very excited that is also part of the conversation today. And having been in this field for over 30 years, I think those are some of the really important developments, is more and more attention to, how our training methods or our care affect animal well-being through monitoring and assessments, and also looking at the larger picture, the people, the organization, the visitors, and everything else. So animal well-being, of course, and this is actually going to probably be one of the last times that we're using this particular framework that we developed over 15, 16 years ago. It was published in 2018, but we are actually in the process of changing it because we don't agree necessarily with all the details anymore. And that's an important aspect of welfare, right? And care is to keep looking at what are all the papers out there? What are the new findings? How do we integrate it and keep dynamic programs going? So 24/7 across lifespan. For example, if you're training an animal when they're younger or when they're older, what might be some of the changes with regards to, for example, cognitive development? And so we have to really look at animal well-being from a 24/7 across lifespan event. And of course, we need to be looking at where do the animals live, geographical area, all those things that are going to have an influence on the well-being of animals. And of course, we have seen incredible developments with regards to the habitats that the animals live in, and the importance of looking at the environment is going to become clearer as I go through this. So a lot of these older buildings, I'm from the Netherlands, we have beautiful old buildings in zoos that today are, more and more used for, say, weddings and other sorts of, activities, and not anymore for hosting animals. So today we have lots of different, here we can see Dublin Zoo outside, lots of different activities, opportunities for animals to make choices, to have control, to have that complexity in the environment, so that they can be the agents of their life to decide what they want to do, when they want to do it, and all those sorts of things as much as possible. And of course, we are also seeing this more and more in the back of house areas. And we already spoke about this at I think it was 2015 ABMA conference, when ABMA hosted the 24/7 across lifespan workshop, which many of you did, and really looking at, okay, so how do we bring the outside inside, right? How do we keep evolving these back of house areas where a lot of animals can spend a lot of time? Or how do we build onto, like the photo on the left, how do we build onto older buildings, so that, as the director of the Sri Lanka Zoo says, this is actually LA, but she sent me a picture of their back of house areas, and they build on top so that the chimpanzees can see the stars. So this sort of, notion to think about what is the life experience like of animals 24/7 around the clock, especially also in the hours that we're not there. So if you've heard the first episode of the podcast, you will hear me talk about this quite a lot, because we are not always at the zoo, at the shelter, at the aquarium, wherever it is that you're working. We're not even always home with our own companion animals, right? So if we look at the time that we are not at the facility and we punch in the numbers, we actually get to 243 days. Yeah, 243 days that we are not on location with the animals. So this is why it's so important to think about, how do we create habitats and environments for animals where they have those choices, where they have
Sabrina, can everybody else?
Possible.
Oh, there we go. Sabrina, you froze there for a few seconds, but
oh dear. So I'll start again. So the importance of 243 days, thank you for letting me know that I froze, is to really look at, how do we provide habitats for animals, front and back of house, hopefully open access, but it might be depending on geographical area, where animals have those choices and control and complexity, so that, they can be as much as possible agents of their own life, and not depend on us as, for all the things that they need and want, because those are a lot of times. So of course, during the day when we're there, we also have a lot of things to do. I worked as an animal caregiver for many years. So we have to really think about what the activities that have been fabulously highlighted in this behavior month. And we need to look at what happens in all the time that we cannot have those particular activities, right? So there's many, many examples. I love traveling all around the world, working with different facilities and seeing their, solutions to particular problems, or just making improvements all the time, right? Making it better all the time, whether it's back of house, front of house, selecting of mates and partners or others coming, all those things, having animals choose which trainer do they want to work with, refurbishing the back of house in a way that it can be used where usually the keepers are. Now the animals can go there in the time that the keepers are not dead, right? How do we become more and more creative in, you know, creating opportunities for animals, especially in the time that we are not there? And in what way can, for example, enrichment programs play into that? So do you have enrichment that's approved during the day without supervision, enrichment during the day with supervision, and then perhaps, and not perhaps, what sort of enrichment is possible and refurbishments are possible in the nighttime without supervision? All those sorts of things are going to play into what can animals do when we are not there to directly care for them. And of course, we have to separate out care and well-being. So the care is the things that we do, right? The things that we give, the things that we remove, the furniture or the things that are the toys, all the things that are in the environment of the animal. And then we have to look at what do they think and feel about that, right? That's the well-being part. And we have to separate them so that we are very clear about these are the things that we do, and this is what animals think about that. And this is why monitoring and assessments are so important. So there will be a copy of this PDF available. So if you want to look at all this, it will be there for you to download. So there's a lot of different current and popular models today is the 5-domain model, those 4 physical domains that give rise to mental states. So this model also helps us think about, if we train with these particular methods, or if we do this particular thing or not do it, then what sort of mental states might we be expecting the animals to have? So I really encourage you to look at the 5 domains model. It has really a lot of different examples. And the podcast, I believe, has a link directly to this free paper that can be downloaded with lots of examples. So, of course, in my last...
Hey, Sabrina.
Or whatever it is that you're working.
You froze again for a second, or a few seconds.
Oh, dear.
Sorry.
No worries. Thank you for letting me know. I'm on the road in a hotel, so I'm sorry I cannot, I have no control over the Wi-Fi quality, but thanks for letting me know. So in the last few slides, what I would like to discuss is, of course, the importance of, when we're thinking about animal care and well-being, we have to take this bird's eye view again and really look at the whole of the zoo or the shelter. Successful in caring for animals and optimal and good well-being, we have to look at who are all these people, who are all these departments, right, that are going to have an influence whether we are going to be successful or not. And this is why it's so important that there are things that we can deal with training and enrichment. And then there's other things in the welfare space where we really have to have that whole we always have to have that whole zoo approach, because of course, if we don't get the time or the money or the resources to do our animal training or enrichment, we're not going to be successful. But for many of the things that we want to do and have this holistic 24/7 across lifespan approach, whether it's with education or conservation or anything else, we have to look at who are all the participants in this system, the ecosystem of systems, right? So that we can be successful and find root cause, solutions to problems rather than dealing with symptoms.
She's going to come back.
Well-being for us. Sorry, do I keep falling away?
Yeah, a little bit. It's not too bad though.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try and start again here. Hopefully you can edit a little bit, or I don't know. The important part, of course, is looking at human aspects of well-being, and to affect us. So we're going to feel good about our work if we can do the things that we want to do for the animals, right? And so we have to look at those sorts of aspects, especially also because we know that human well-being and animal well-being can be closely interconnected and can effect on each other, right? So whether it is how we work with the animals, but also how we assess their well-being and so on. So as we have a holistic approach for caring for animals, we also have to see that around human well-being, right? And ultimately also planetary well-being. And these have been some of the great evolutions that I've seen about animal well-being around the world, is that there is this more holistic approach to all the aspects that are going to affect animals, people, and planet. And that's wonderful to see. So we are many, many people all around the world, whether it's the ICZ, all the different zoo associations, the workshop at the ABMA in Denmark 8 years ago. We're all little pieces of a puzzle. We all have our different expertise, whether we are expert animal trainers, enrichment, nutrition, all these things have to come together for us to have good animal well-being and good animal care programs. And of course, also for us to feel joy and purpose in our life as we care for animals, and other goals such as conservation, education, research, and more. And thank you so much, ABMA, for putting on this amazing Behavior Month and all the content that are going to help us care for animals in a variety of ways.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Yes.
Okay, for there. Thank you for sharing all of your knowledge, experiences. Obviously, welfare, well-being is, like you said, the heart of kind of everything that we do. So for me, I know when doing listening in on that podcast, while we think about welfare all of the time, every day, it's good to kind of take everything else away sometimes, and kind of revisit just the basics, why we do what we do and how we're doing it. So I think this is good information for all of us to think about all of the time. So we have some participants that have contributed content to this year's Behavior Month. So we want to definitely hear from you and a little bit about what you shared with us, any highlights you want everybody to know. And then again, anybody joining, if you have questions, ideas, comments, please feel free to join in at any time. But why don't we start with Jim? You can go over a little bit of your content that was on our Facebook page.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, I'd like to say one of my biggest inspirations when I first started out, before I was even got the role of Animal Behaviour Management Officer at ZSL, was a workshop I attended at Chessington with Sabrina and Kirsten, who was Anetta's co-chair or chair of the EASA training group. And so, yes, thank you very much, Sabrina, for that inspiration all those many years ago. I really appreciate it. Still think about that 2 or 3 days very, very fondly. Yeah, so the ZSL content that we shared for this ABMA month in terms of the training, we talked about enrichment last week with Justin and some of the other guys, and had a really good time talking through that. Was directly as a result of Chris Jenkins, who is an ABMA board member, who was in London at the same time as we were hosting our internal ZSL Behaviour Management Committee presentation evening. So this is something we do every single year, and we invite everyone from across the organisation, and the organisation includes conservation programs and scientists and the Learned Society, and all sorts of different people, and then of course all your marketing and commercial teams and IT and everyone, and they all come along and they find out what we've been up to for the last year in terms of behaviour management. So this is training and enrichment programs that we think are worth sharing internally. And I invited Chris along because we like to go to the pub sometimes in London, and he's a good drinking buddy. So he went after the evening. He said, "Look, some of these things are going to be really cool to share for the ABMA Behaviour Month." And normally it's Ellie and myself who are kind of Ellie Newman, who I think is on the call at the moment, who discuss what we're going to put on for ZSL. And so this was quite novel, having Chris and Ellie deciding what we were going to put onto this year. And he said some of the less familiar and less represented taxa that we talked about in that presentation evening would be great. And he particularly liked the salamander, so the Chinese giant salamander, the copper band butterfly fish, and then we also talked about this particular program about training birds to come into a certain area and then having the environment almost isolate them into that area. We call it self-trapping. It's like the old pigeon loft system. And one of my colleagues, Tom, very ingeniously created a whole version of this for ZSL's bird department. So he started off with an emerald dove that he needed to bring in from a big mixed species aviary, and how was he going to isolate those two individuals into this space while, you know, after they'd been released into that area. And then he kind of developed it and worked on that from different types of pigeon species, so tropical pigeon species, and then getting bigger and bigger until he's talking about doing it with ibis and storks. And then even more ingeniously, some small passerines that live in another mixed species area. And he designed a particular entrance to a back of house area that meant they could fly in really easily, but found it difficult to get out because there was an angle at the a particular angle of where they drop into the aviary, and they couldn't get out. And this was just a good solution for not having to catch these animals manually in those bigger areas where it, you know, really does have a huge impact on the rest of the group. So yeah, please go ahead and watch that one. I found it really interesting when he was talking me through all those different programs, and we are working on you know, developing that program in terms of making it more of a training solution, as well as so like placing some of these behaviors of coming back of house under stimulus control rather than it being for a prolonged period of time. So that was the bird one. Then the salamander and the fish. So the Chinese giant salamander was one of the most inspiring training programs I've been sent through in recent times. So we're opening a brand new reptile house at ZSL London Zoo. Our old one is about 150 odd years old or something ridiculous like that. So it's really not great in terms of life support systems. So we've got a brand new building that's opening. And amazingly, the guys, the Herp team there, have trained every single lizard to be trained for transportation. And so, you know, this is from your Komodo dragon. Well, actually, the Komodo staying in the same place, but large monitor lizards right the way down to dwarf geckos have been trained for transportation to this new facility, and it's really great. But Kim and Jamie, who were working with the Chinese giant salamander, were like, well, we can't leave the amphibians out, especially not this big one. So they decided they wanted to train the giant salamander for transportation. And they did it, again, rather ingeniously by training him to target into a kind of a small low-level crate tray sort of thing. So yeah, watch that video. One of the things I really like about that is the creative solution problem-solving stuff, because when they sent me through the training plan, I was adamant that they needed some kind of UPVC pipe that they could then cap off at the end and making it easier for the animal to sort of almost just walk into. But they totally ignored me and they were successful. So I'm really delighted for them. And it's a good lesson to me as well. The copper band butterfly fish training I've loved for years. So Keenan and Alistair, who originally trained it way back about 2012, something like that. That we did it in a certain way in the old aquarium building, and then it was updated by the current crop of aquarists at ZSL, and we've got 3 of these copper band butterfly fish, 2 of which they've trained. And so I actually represent the training program for that, because Aaron, who did actually originally do the presentation at our BMC night, he didn't have time, bless him. So I said I'd take that one for him, and I know the program really, really well because I've supported them through it. And yeah, I'm really proud of the team for continuing or restarting that training program. It's basically about pest control and reducing and minimizing stress through transportation with fish. Rather than netting them, we train them into a jug. And then the dwarf mongoose is actually a really old program that we wanted to share. So Thomas Maunders and I, so Thomas is the chair of the Whipsnade BMC, Behaviour Management Committee, along with Jeremy. We chose this particular presentation because it's one where dwarf mongoose, not really considered that much for training in the UK, certainly. And this was a training program that Tom did. It was his very first ever training program back in 2015. And it took him ages and ages. And what he wanted to share was all the things that he did well. In other words, the persistence and the constant evaluation and adjustment of the training program. And
now Jim is frozen. Maybe Sabrina, it wasn't just your connection. Is anybody else there that can hear me, or are we all frozen?
Yes.
I can hear you.
It's Jim who's frozen, I think.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll give him a second. I can also message him. But maybe in the meantime, we can go to Shelby while we get Jim's connection worked out. Are you still there, Shelby? Hi. You want to talk
Hi.
about Arizona training?
Yeah. So my name's Shelby. I work at Arizona Wildlife Park in Williams, Arizona. For Behavior Month this year, we submitted a video talking about the transparency that we've started bringing into a lot of our training programs. So the video starts with just like a really brief recent history of our training program, which back in 2021 we brought in Natural Encounters, and they helped us kind of get our training to a new level. We started training a lot more cooperative care behaviors, and it was all going really well. So we decided that we wanted to start sharing that with our guests. And so we did a couple things to be able to do that. So one of them was we started a VIP experience where people could now go behind the scenes with our wolves and watch a training demonstration where they got to actually show off the wolves giving themselves voluntary vaccines, as well as voluntary ear meds for like flies and whatnot. And then in the department that I work in, we started a daily behind the scenes chat with our grizzly bears where we just open the gates and let people come behind the scenes. They watch us, as we're working on new behaviors. And actually every behavior that those bears have learned in the last year and a half has been in front of the public. We don't really ever work with them without there being guests there now, which is cool. And, we started this because we wanted to, show off some of this really cool behavior, these behaviors that the animals were learning. But we found that our guests have really responded super well to these new things. And we're starting to look for ways that we can do it in more areas in the future when we're building new habitats, looking for ways to include guest viewing areas in our, back of house, backstage, lockdowns, whatever you want to call them. So yeah, that's kind of what our presentation was about, and how, through all this, we're hoping that we've increased our guest perception of our animals' welfare by, kind of breaking down those mental and physical barriers of what they can see and what they can't see when the animals are off exhibit.
Sorry, I was just chatting with Ellie, who was chatting with Jim. He is coming back on.
Cool.
But when he can in a minute. So yeah, and when Jim comes back on, remind me to go back to some of that fish training, because I definitely had some thoughts about that. And let me see, nobody else is back here yet. All right. We'll give him another minute to come back on. But again, if anybody has anything to add, feel free to do it in the chat, raise your hand, or chime in. And Ellie definitely gave me a good reminder to everybody that people will be watching on YouTube as well, because this is being recorded, and we'll add it to our YouTube channel. So we can, I know as soon as we go on to another topic, Jim's going to sign back on, but that's okay. We can be flexible. Barbara and Ellie, do you all, and Danielle is there too, do you all have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would have a question for Shelby. When you started doing the visitor, like taking the visitors back to the training sessions, did you see, or how did your animals perceive that?
So that's a really good question. For our grizzly bears, they have always just been very easy animals, so to speak. They didn't really have a reaction one way or the other. For our wolves, our grizzly bears are a lot younger than our wolves too, I'll add. Our wolves, when we started this, they were already geriatric, so there were a few who were not interested in coming and, kind of being in front of a crowd, but we had one rock star who, he kind of ended up being the wolf for the training presentation, and the other wolves got that same training just when guests weren't there. And then we have a new pack of wolf puppies. They're now a little over a year, and those guys coming into that environment now are all okay with being in front of people too, since they came into it so young. But for the most part, all the animals were good with it. And if they weren't, they didn't have to come over.
And do you also include the guests somehow? Like,
so that's a great, yeah, that's a great point. We are working on more ways to start including guests, to making things more interactive. So one of the things that they started doing out at that wolf training is when they line the wolves up for the voluntary vaccines, they'll actually have a guest come and now hold that syringe pole. And so they're feeling the pressure of the wolf backing into it. We're still working on it with our grizzly bears, finding ways to make it more interactive, but that's one of the really cool things that they're doing over with the wolves.
That's awesome.
That is really cool. Yeah.
Super cool stuff. So I was going to ask, I'm changing the topic slightly here, but for Sabrina, we kind of, I think, touched on it a little bit during the podcast, but what, I guess, words of wisdom, pointers, advice do you have for folks that might be doing welfare assessments on a whole group of animals versus individual animals? I don't know, pros and cons, and maybe kind of tricks to the trade. If you're doing a group, is there a way to still consider on some level an individual level of welfare?
Yes. So yeah, I think so. Animal well-being assessments, so we can do risk assessments, right? For, like, we heard wonderful examples just now, whether, you know, what are the opportunities and what are maybe the challenges when we are working with visitors or a particular program or what have you not. So if you're doing animal welfare assessments or monitoring over time, so obviously we do that every day. And I would say that there's that part of, like, once I had this wonderful question from the late Bernard Rollin, who is, who wrote a lot about animal ethics and animal well-being. And he asked me, like, how many sheep do you need for one healthy and happy sheep? So I think that's sort of the question that you can look at when you're assessing a group, as looking at what sort of quality or interactions do they have, or can they have, depending on, can a fish school in a proper way? Are there enough fish for them to do that sort of behavior, right? And then you can also zoom into individual animals. Of course, you're looking at the fish, their bodies, how they're swimming, how they're eating, and all those sorts of things. And that's, of course, a lot more challenging than perhaps, doing a welfare assessment on 5 wolves. But you can still ask sort of similar questions, I would say, or looking more at group behavior. Can animals do the things that they are supposed to be doing if they're a whole bunch of ants together, or those fishes or sheep? What are some of those behaviors or some of the things that they need for in their a whole of the group of them together? But as people work with their animals really well, they become extremely attuned, as you know, to being able to, especially when animals are in a group and there are many of them, it is also those that are maybe not doing so well that are standing out. So I would say, do look at natural history and all those sorts of things to really see, have we got the conditions, the environments, the social group, the numbers, too few, too many, all those sorts of things, and then see what are some of the indicators that we want to look at on the individual level, which, can be challenging, but it's not necessarily impossible.
Awesome. Thank you. That does provide clarity. My brain got going after the podcast a little bit more. So Jim is back, which is good. We'll go back to him in a minute. But Barbara, did you want to talk about your content?
Yeah, sure. I talked about the crowned eagle I worked with in Tanzania, in a sanctuary. And it was funny because I was at the NEI workshop when I got the call that we found a juvenile crowned eagle was brought to our place in Tanzania. And I didn't know that kind of eagle. And I asked around in the room, and I went to Steve and asked him about it. And everybody was like, whoa, that is one of the most powerful eagles. And they're pretty challenging because of their, like, what they like because of the strength and the power and what they need in order to be to learn how to hunt. And so yeah, I went to Africa 2-3 months later after this workshop and met this. No, the workshop was in December, so in January I went there again. So it was a little bit more than a month later. I went there and saw this crowned eagle for the first time, and she was more or less, well, she was found in an area where she wasn't supposed to be, and she was mildly injured. And we took her in because we couldn't just take her back to the national park where she probably was from, because we didn't know where her parents were, and she was maybe a year old. And we couldn't just put her back there because, well, monkeys probably would just kill her, whatever. So we took her to our place, and we had her in a small little room where she could recover from her injuries. And I started to have my first interactions with her, hand feeding her. But it was a really small room, so she didn't really. It was good for her to recover, but it wasn't a good place for her to stay, obviously. So we started to build a big aviary for her, rather remote, so not many people would pass by because it really stressed her out. And then after about 2 months after working with her, we moved her into this new aviary. The aviary was about 11 meters high. And I thought at this point, when we put her there, I thought, well, she at least, we've come some kind of relationship already. She would take food from my hand. She didn't show any kind of aggression or whatnot. So I thought, well, if we put her into this new aviary after a few days of getting used to it, we will probably just continue with the training. But that wasn't like that at all. So when we put her there, she, within the first 10 minutes, she flew all the way up onto the highest branch and wouldn't come down anymore at all. So I asked around a lot other falconers and people who had a lot of experience with these kinds of eagles, and they said, well, they can not eat for more than a week, and I can just wait, not feed her, and after a week or 10 days I go there and offer the food and she will come because she will be hungry. But that wasn't the way I wanted to work with her. So I started a different training program based on negative reinforcement. So I would go into this enclosure, and the bird would not move while I was there. She was hardly, I could hardly see her, and she was so still. So I thought, well, what is better than not moving is any kind of movement. So I started to sit there inside the aviary, maybe for 2 hours in the beginning, and then wait for her to make one step to the side, because she was a bird, so at some point she had to move. And as soon as she made this one step, I left the food there and left the area, and she could come down whenever she wanted to have her food, so I didn't have to starve her. And then after some repetitions, I noticed that she started to move faster after I entered the aviary. So I would just sit down and she starts to move. So I would leave again. And then I started to wait. Well, I basically did a shaping process based on negative and positive reinforcement. I asked her to move more, like 2 steps or one side and then the other side, and then I would leave. And this way I could convince her to come down all the way to work with me. And I could I had a short period of protected contact training because it was still in my head. All the stories people told me about the power of crowned eagle were still in my head. And she was, once the distance was too small and she was all the way down on the ground or on the lowest branches, she would become maybe a little bit nervous, if we can label it like that. So I thought I'd start with protected contact training. I asked her to fly from one branch to the other from the outside. And then finally I could work with her free contact and right beside her, hand feeding her, having her on the scale. We started crate training. And it was pretty cool because I didn't have a single location where I had to starve her in order to work with me, which was for me very important. I don't know how important it was for her, but for me it was very important to do it this way. Yeah, so it's basically the story.
Awesome. We have lots of good content and good stories for sure this week. So Jim is back. We were just messaging, and he's going to try to pick up where he left off. I believe. You still there, Jim? I see you.
Yeah, sorry about that, everyone. I have no idea what happened. The only thing is there's building work going on in my house, and I'm wondering whether something went wrong just for a second there, because it just like went kind of totally dropped out. I left the meeting and everything, so I do apologize. So I got up to like the fish, right? So I was talking about the fish. Okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah, so and the only other one I wanted to let you know about was the mongoose one, and the dwarf mongoose are another one of those underrepresented species when it comes to training. Partly because of the habitats they tend to be housed in, it's relatively easy to catch them, unfortunately. And so back in 2015, my colleague Tom Maunders, who's presented about this, he's the chair of the co-chair of the Behaviour Management Committee at Whipsnade. We wanted to share this story because it's all about the sort of mistakes, if you like, in inverted commas, or the things we could have done better. So we wanted to share those with, because we think that's a really important thing. It's all very well just saying this is how brilliant my training was, but sometimes it's about the things that don't go quite as well that are interesting to share, right? So he wanted to share that, what we might have done differently, but also the qualities that he showed in his very first training program that he'd done with an exotic animal when he first started at the zoo, because he was really persistent. He was continually evaluating and adjusting the training, and he refused to bow down to the pressures, if you like, to manually restrain the animals. He wanted to train them. So that's the story. And I'm really proud of Tom for sharing that one, because I think it does show a really interesting program.
There's a lot. Am I muted? No, I'm not. There's a lot of good story. Barbara, you always have stories that kind of tug on the heartstrings. And yeah, there's so much good stuff. All of Behavior Month, but especially this week. Sorry, I'm monitoring messages as we do this too. So did anybody else on the Zoom provide any content that you want to go over? I want to make sure that I don't miss anyone. Okay. If so, throw your hand up, cut me off, chime in, because we want to hear all the stories for sure. And Jim, I have to tell you, your content got me extra thinking, because I wish I could show you all, but I have a saltwater aquarium at home, and I just recently upgraded because I thought the welfare of my tanks was not so great. So I went to a larger tank. It's currently cycling, but all of my fish are living in a tub on my living room floor. So now I'm like, the pressure's on. I'm going to need to train all of them to go into a jug to go into their bigger tank. I'm looking at it right now. It's hard to turn the camera to show you that.
Yeah, no pressure. Fun enough, Aaron, the guy that the recent guy that trained the jug fish with Colette and Kat, he's actually training a group of tang as well. So in the big coral reef tank that features in the presentation, just briefly in a picture, he's got a group of tanks. So one of them is a large tang, Barian tang, and he's targeted that to come over to one side of the tank, and then the entire other group he's training to go into a side area so that he can then house the, corral them into one place while the other one is being trained in the other space there. So we'll share that one next year, maybe, if it's successful.
That's awesome. I'm going to have to get with you guys. I'm ready to move. I think I have another week or so and I can move everybody over. So see what kind of training I can get done in a week. Okay. Yeah. So monitoring the chat there. Anybody else have any questions? I like to talk, so I want to make sure that I'm not talking over everybody's questions, giving everybody an opportunity. One thing, that does strike me, not to show my age, but, I've been in the field maybe like 23-ish years, something like that. But just the fact that we're talking about fish or salamanders, right? And their choice and their welfare, to me, at least from my experiences, that's not necessarily something that we would have been talking about when I first started. I mean, we're talking about welfare and well-being way more now than ever before, but more importantly, I'd say even the species that would often get overlooked. So hearing those stories to me is super cool. Do you agree, Sabrina? Like, when you're going, talking to the different folks at different facilities, welfare is now looked at with all species rather than just the big megafauna.
Yeah, I think the I've always had, you know, on the 20 years that we celebrate next year with Animal Concepts, but also before that, visiting different facilities, I've always had people, you know, say, can you come and look at our ants? Like super, you know, this sort of like people who work with their animals, they're super excited and they're, you know, wanting to do the best, right? But
Yeah.
our requests have never come in at the ant level. So they come in at the elephant or the bear or right. And that's not just true in zoos and aquariums. We also work with research facilities. So we get hired to work with primates or dogs. And then when we're in there, you know, there are people that say, can you come have a look at our birds and at our fishes? And I think it's super wonderful that there is more explicit, right? Like you said, we always are thinking about the well-being of the animals. We're just much more explicit about it now, and that it matters to all. Like I was at the AZA conference last month, and they, you know, their whole theme for this year was understudied species, right? And AZA has these beautiful monthly newsletters go out with the new publications, and the understudied species, fishes and reptiles, they're highlighted in bold, right? This is important and it's happening. So that's really great. So yeah, I think it's wonderful that it's much more explicit, that we're talking about everybody in the zoo and not the usual suspects.
Yeah, for sure. Ellie is gonna, are you there, Ellie? There she is.
And hi. Yeah, I thought I'd jump in on that side and just talk a little bit about some of the presentations we had from Australia. It's a very bad time zone for them at the moment. I think it's like midnight or 1 a.m. But it sort of leads on nicely from what Sabrina was saying. Jade Fountain from Animal Behavior Matters, she wanted to present something about domestic animals. So her presentation's coming up on Sunday or the 30th, maybe Monday. And she was talking about scent work as enrichment for domestic species. And that led her to also do a nice presentation for scent work as enrichment for varied species in zoos. So when you see her presentation coming up, it's really interesting. She doesn't only have the dogs and the domestic animals that do a lot of scent work and enrichment, but also has things such as, you know, horses, elephants, studies done on elephants, studies done on meerkats, studies done on different primate species. So it's a really, really interesting one looking at scent utilized for animal welfare and enrichment. So I think that's a really nice one for people to look forward to, which is coming up this week. Another Australian presenter from Zoos Victoria, Lauren Irving, she presents a really great presentation. I think she did it at the beginning of the week. I can't remember the calendar off by heart, but I'm pretty sure it was at the beginning of this week. And she talks about training their ostrich for voluntary hooding. And it's a really well done presentation. I do recommend everyone have a look at it, just because she's presented it really nicely. And she's talked about how people have caught up ostriches in the past, how they used to hood them for procedures because it tends to, I guess, they see a change in their behavior, but how they wanted to really improve on the welfare of these animals during these procedures, and how they use targeting to train a voluntary hooding. So the ostriches come up and they can put these hoods on them, which innately helps their procedures as well. So that was a really, really great presentation. And Lauren's also been really kind to give us some resources for members. I think there's 3 or 4 ostrich training plans that's on the member website as well. So that's really beneficial as well. And I think coming up on our last day of Behavior Month, we have the EASA Animal Training Working Group. And Barbara and Annetta have present about the animal training guidelines. So Jim will know more about that because I think he was a part of it. But they give a really great presentation about the EASA animal training guidelines. So that's bringing us to the end of Behavior Month with our final Welfare Around the World week, and also a couple of extra days there on the side.
Just in case everybody doesn't know, but Ellie is our creator, founder of Behavior Month. We can't do it without Ellie. She always has the ideas. It gets getting bigger and bigger every year too. So thank you, Ellie. ABMA, thank you. And just sharing all of this information and finding new ways to share it is so important. So great idea by Ellie, and I'm glad that you could be here with us. for our last
Zoom. And that's the last time you're allowed to do anything live, because that's embarrassing. But thank you.
Awesome. We love us, Ellie. Sabrina has her hand up. I see.
Yes, I was just thinking about, we heard really great examples today about refinement, right? Making things better and better, like asking questions, how can we make this better? How can we, have whether it's our body language or the tools that we use and all those sorts of things. Specifically, how do we move, to positive reinforcement training? All those sorts of things are like active activities in the space when we are directly interacting with animals or thinking about interacting with them and working with them. And one of the things that I find extremely important to look at is what are animals learning, or what have they learned about what we do when we clean, anticipation of feeding, other sorts of activities, right? So to look at animal training, so what has been learned in a formal way, what has been learned in an informal way, and in what ways can we, in what ways do they affect the animals in a positive way, or perhaps not necessarily in a positive way? So is there like anticipatory behavior that is good for the animals, or maybe not good for the animals? So one of the things that I think is important when we're thinking about animal well-being and learning and training in general is to look at what are the things that animals have learned or might be learning, especially if we do sort of proactive work in the space of informal learning, or maybe undesired or unwanted learning. So I think, to sort of broaden our conversation here, I would love to, so for example, when I go into a zoo or an aquarium or so on, I look at how our animals, obviously, how they interact with me or react to me as somebody they don't know, but also how do they interact with, the care staff or the visitors, or what are the behaviors that I'm seeing or not expecting that I don't see, but I might see things in their environment that point to some, unwanted behaviors or stereotypies, or I might see animals who are super, engaged and wanting to interact with, the visitor program that's coming up. But so this sort of, expansion of how is learning and training affecting animals directly in our one-to-one sessions or group sessions, as well as maybe the things that they are learning that are helpful or not so helpful in a broader perspective.
Sorry, I was muted. That's a really good point or way to look at things too, Sabrina, because we often don't do that. What you were just talking about reminded me of a discussion we had at the last ABMA conference in Atlanta, and it kind of went on after. Some of us were still talking about it on our trips home too, but the idea that should animals be only really focused on the start of their training session, and the rest of their time, right? Like they're just waiting for their training session to start. And the suggestion was that like their environments should be enriching enough on their own that the, training and the keepers or trainers coming over to start a session is not like the highlight of their day. And through all the discussion, at least in my head, kind of where I fell on it is, I do want to be the most reinforcing thing to the animal, but there's probably a line. So they shouldn't probably just wait, like lay all day. And then when they hear us opening a gate to come over, to start the session, then they get up, they do a session that they're really into and engaged, and then they go back to doing nothing. And our only snapshot is that session where they're very engaged and mentally stimulated. But, I think there is a fine line. I've also seen, it came up in these discussions too, where learning from a training session kind of spills over to their free time. I've worked with animals that, for lack of a better word, I've seen practicing or doing behaviors outside of session times that they were learning in a session. And so the example I could think of from my experience, that must have been happening for a while, before we even realized it, because we don't have eyes on them. Like Sabrina, you were saying, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So the free time learning, or when we think they're not learning, they still are, and we should take that into consideration as well. Good point. We're coming up here on the final minutes of the Zoom. So is there anything else, any other topics, questions? I'm going to check the chat as I say this, that anybody wants to ask any of the contributors? No? And Sabrina, I did want to ask, your information is on our podcast notes and things like that. But for our Zoom folks, especially those that might be watching later after it's on YouTube, do you want to give some information about what you do, your company, and maybe website they can find you at if they have more questions for you?
Yeah, if there is a comment, is comments allowed on the YouTube at the ABMA?
Yes.
Okay,
yep.
So I will just put our link there, and if you have any questions, you can just reach out to the Animal Concepts team, and I can share some links there, like to 24/7 across lifespan. There's a whole bunch of free resources that anybody can access. So yeah, thank you for the invitation again.
And thank you for joining us. And just a plug for everybody now, but everybody that's going to be watching the recorded session too, join ABMA. I got to meet all of these awesome people through ABMA. Now we're on Zoom, but you know, I've met each of you in person at different times. And so at the very beginning of the Zoom, we were talking about the Denmark conference. And so that was, out of all of the conferences I've been to, I think that's where I've met the most people. For some reason, everybody just kind of came together at that conference. But any of the conferences, I always meet somebody new that's doing really incredible things. So that is one of the many benefits of being an ABMA member. There is a membership directory too. So as far as contact information goes, you can go, if you're a member, on the website and get contact information from anybody that you might have met, or maybe that you didn't meet. I've definitely done that before. I've looked for ABMA members at certain facilities on the member list to get information about a different animal I was working with, or I remember them presenting years later and been able to ask questions using that membership directory. So a little bit of a plug for ABMA. But I want to thank everybody for joining us for the last Zoom of this year's Behavior Month, also for providing all of the content. And we'll keep the conversation going even after this. We're always monitoring our social media. So questions, ideas, things like that is a great way to reach out to ABMA, and then also through our ABMA website. Ellie, do you have anything to add as our final Zoom for Behavior Month?
I was just writing a quick thank you to you, Justin, for taking the lead on all the Zooms and for doing this. But thank you to everyone for contributing. We've been so appreciative of the type of content that we've had this year. It's been, every year it just gets bigger and better. And we have the amount, we'll tally it up at the end of the month, but the amount of people that are viewing the content, I think, is an amazing thing. The fact that so many people from so many different countries all around the world are just seeing these snippets of behavior, whether it's training, enrichment, welfare assessments. There was something about team resiliency and resilience in your keepers. And I think that in itself is, I think, beneficial, that we just keep talking about behavior, keep that conversation going. And hopefully one day it's going to be behavior all year, not just Behavior Month, but that's for another year. But thank you, everyone, for being a part of it.
2025. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. And until next time. Goodbye,
Thanks,
everyone.
See ya. Thanks for the invitation to Ellie and Justin. See ya.
Thank you. Bye-bye.